After a 3-4 start, what do we make of the Cincinnati Bengals from a big picture perspective so far in the 2024 season? Let's break it down.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. I'm your host, Jake Liscow. He's your host, James Rapien. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network here on Locked On Bengals, covering your team every day on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Welcome back to the everydayers. Welcome back to those of you who make us your first listen. We appreciate the regulars. And shout out to those of you who are new. You can subscribe to the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast to stay up to date on all things Bengals throughout this season and off season, of course, because that your team every day does not stop as the NFL offseason does its thing. Today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. You can place your first $5 bet and get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed at FanDuel.com, where you can get started. And James, let's take a step back today. Let's take a step back and think about this Bengals season from a big picture perspective. We are a long way from where we thought they would be, from our preseason expectations, from their preseason expectations. It was a disastrous start to the season. Since then, they've recovered and are on a 3-1 stretch, but that 0-3 start has them at 3-4 overall with wins against the likes of the worst teams in the NFL, the Cleveland Browns, the Carolina Panthers, two of those wins, and two of the unambiguously worst teams in the NFL, the New York Giants, not too far off in that conversation either. You add into that narrow losses to some of the teams considered the better teams in the NFL, the Baltimore Ravens, the Kansas City Chiefs, and I think you can start to put the Washington Commanders into that conversation. It becomes difficult to parse what exactly this Bengals team is with all of those confounding variables and injuries and individual stories from week to week that you try to decipher and figure out where this team is going forward.
They're a talented but flawed group that is trying to find itself while rebounding and climbing out of a big hole. And that's really tough to do. And they've done it in the past. And I think that's what is interesting is that they had never started 0-3 before. They were looking at 1-4 in back-to-back road games, and I don't care who it's against. I don't care if it's against ITT Tech. That's tough. And so they've shown some resilience, and yet there are still questions, right? After these past two wins, Jake Liscow has gotten on him and like, yeah, but, and why? Why have you done that? Because there's still questions. They're still like, all right, how good are they really? And the good news is you can give yourself some leeway if you're winning games. How good are they really? And they didn't win enough of them in September. And so you look up now and it's like, all right, well, 3-1 in their last four, but still very much in a hole compared to where I had them. I thought they'd probably be 5-2 right now. I think that's a fair assessment. Where they lose potentially to Baltimore, lose potentially to the Chiefs. But even with that, and even with Washington being better than expected, at minimum 4-3, right? And that's where that Patriots game really cost you. So yeah, this team, there's questions. And I think let's start with the offense, because this offense, you time back 3 weeks ago and we're like, drop 40. Drop 40. And we said it as recent as 2 weeks ago. I think you got to drop 40. And they've done the opposite of that the past couple of weeks, scoring a combined 31 points over the past two games, winning both of those games. And yeah, their playmakers are still making plays. The offensive line looks solid. Joe hasn't been bad. And yet they're not putting up the points at the same clip that they were through really weeks 2 through 5. But certainly weeks 3 through 5 when they were scoring 30 plus per game. Where are you at on this offense, big picture wise right now?
It's a bit confusing, right? They had these really good performances, and we thought the Baltimore Ravens were going to be at least a decent defense. I don't think that I had any illusion that Washington was a good defense, at least that week. We went into that week and I was saying that they should get going against this Washington defense. They did, and it just wasn't enough because the defense was worse. The Carolina team has one of the worst teams in the NFL, period. And Baltimore, apparently you can throw on this year. And the Bengals did that to great effect. So when I think about this offense right now, from a big picture perspective, I think Joe Burrow is still a really good player. I am a bit concerned about protection if Orlando Brown has to miss time, which isn't a very big picture thought. But overall, protection has been better for Burrow and this passing offense than we've seen it. They've been more diverse in their concepts. They're going to more 12 personnel. They're doing more formational things. They're using more motion than we've seen in the past. They're getting some results from that, but the last couple of weeks against real pass rushes, real defensive lines, some flaws have shown up on the offensive side of the ball that we didn't necessarily anticipate. We have to see how long that's going to last, with a couple more good pass rushes in Philly and Vegas in the next couple of weeks, and Baltimore, who has now hit their stride at 5-2 to follow. So overall, you feel like, yeah, Joe Burrow is still a really good quarterback. At least there are flashes of it in the games where he's not executing at a high level for the entire game. There are at least a couple plays where you're like, yep, he's still really good. We don't really have concerns about the risks affecting his performance significantly. At this point, we've seen enough to know that he can still execute at one of the highest levels of quarterback in the NFL. That's great. You also have Jamar Chase, who maybe is the best receiver in the NFL this year, certainly leads the league in several statistics, has been incredibly productive. His receiving DVOA, or DR is the DVOA stat for individual players, is the highest in the NFL as well. So you got Jamar Chase, who's really effective. You got T. Higgins, who's really effective. And then you have questions beyond that. Chase Brown has been a bit of a dynamic addition at running back. Night and day difference there between him and Zach Moss that we've talked about, right? Where when he gets the ball, he's a big play waiting to happen. You've seen him do that a little bit. But the running game in general has too many negative plays. The run blocking isn't where it needs to be for that to be a consistently effective weapon. And sometimes they can break something off, but that isn't really where it needs to be. So you have 4 players that you feel really good about at the skill positions. You feel good about Orlando Brown, feel pretty good about Ted Karras. I like what Amari Smith has done as a rookie, but he's still a rookie. And I want to see that complete game performance against a better team than we've seen. Like the best defense that they've been effective against, more or less, is probably Kansas City back in week 2. And they had the benefit of a lot of takeaways in that game from their own defense to help set them up. So you can still see the ceiling, but you need that third piece to step up right now, I think, in the receiving game in particular, that they don't really have a consistent third option right now the last few weeks, where it's really been going through T and Jamar, which is great. But there are times where you're like, well, if they take away T and Jamar in this play, where's Joe going for that third option? And it hasn't always been there. And I think that's shown up a little bit in the last couple of weeks.
Sure, it has. And part of that is these matchups. We knew it was going to be ugly in New York, at least to a degree, and certainly ugly in Cleveland. It always is. I think if you would have told me, this is a big picture conversation, but that Joe Burrow was second in completion percentage through 7 games, like, oh, interesting. 6th in yards, 1,759 yards. The completion percentage, by the way, 70.4. 3rd in touchdown passes, 14. Only 2 interceptions. 3rd in quarterback rating, 110. Like, all right, this dude is playing at an extremely high level, considering the circumstances, considering where we were at. Let's just go back to the Colts joint practice, where it was check down central, and there were a lot of completions, but it's like, why is he not pushing the ball downfield? And questions about that. I do think for this offense to take the next step, though, because you're getting high-level quarterback play. You're getting the best offensive line play, and we'll see on Orlando Brown Jr., but the best offensive line play that we've seen, I would say, from a pass protection standpoint of the Joe Burrow era. You have T playing at the best he's played, Jamar playing at probably as good as he's ever played. And so even if the numbers aren't as identical and as explosive as they were as a rookie, just everything that he's doing. But you do need another piece. And I think that's where we can continue the conversation. Who could that be? Who should that be? I think people have thoughts on that. We will obviously discuss the defense as well. That and more coming up next.
This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by Gametime, where it is easier than ever to get tickets. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets to see the Bengals play with their whiteout uniforms against the Eagles live easier than ever. They filter out the fluff to show you only the most incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to filter through all of the other options, wasting time searching through thousands of tickets. And as we've told you time and time again with Game Time, the features in this app give you peace of mind and make buying tickets a streamlined process. Not only is the Game Time Picks feature there for you, but you've also got all-in pricing, so you're not going to get surprised by hidden fees when you check out. And Game Time lowest price guarantee, where they will credit you 110% of the difference if they do not have the lowest price for those tickets. You can take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. All you have to do is download the Game Time app and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll save $20 on your first purchase of tickets. Again, terms apply, but you can create an account and use code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off that first purchase of tickets. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time.
Today's show is also brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy the way it should be. The best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. All you do is pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on PrizePicks. So maybe you think Justin Jefferson will get more than 83.5 yards next week, or that Jamar Chase will get more than on his PrizePicks projection. Maybe you think that Chase Brown is going to have a big day on the ground against the Philadelphia Eagles. Well, PrizePicks is the best way to win real money this football season. All you have to do is download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use code LOCKEDONNFL after you download that PrizePicks app, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game.
Let's talk third options, James. People do have thoughts, big thoughts. And I'm inclined to agree that it's time for a bit of a mix-up at wide receiver 3. I'm also curious about whether they can get Eric Hall a little bit more involved, if they can find that role that there was at the beginning of the season for Mike Gesicki that's mostly gone away since T. Higgins has returned. And that's fine to see more volume go to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Don't get me wrong. But I do think that that consistent third option that the Bengals have been so accustomed to with Tyler Boyd lately, or for the last few years, for Joe Burrow's tenure in Cincinnati anyway, is not so constant this year.
Sure, it's not. And I don't know if they're necessarily missing Tyler Boyd. Like, I don't think that he would necessarily be that guy right now either. I think that they're searching a bit. But this is why Jermaine Burton was drafted. This is why, for our everydayers, we talked so much about wide receiver in March and April going into the draft, because wide receiver is always going to be something you discuss. It's their bread and butter. And in needing not high-end necessarily receivers, but guys that are going to win around T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, or Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. You need a go-to third option. And Andre Iosivas, I thought it might be a big Iosivas game against the Browns. I really did. And he had one target. These receivers didn't catch a pass not named T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. They had 9 receptions. No other receiver had a catch. And that's wild. Mike Gesicki was the only tight end with a catch, 2 yards. Outside of Mike Gesicki, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase, it was Chase Brown and Zach Moss. I just named everyone that caught a pass in that game. And you're going to need someone to emerge. Maybe it is Eric Hall. Maybe it is Mike Gesicki, finding a way for him to get more ups, because you know what he is as a pass catcher. You know what he can bring in key moments, certainly with his size and his speed and agility. But I think a lot of people are thinking Jermaine Burton. And so this is why, if you're Jermaine, and I hope he's been handling everything the right way. He was active after being inactive against the Giants, but 3 run blocking snaps. I don't think he ran a route. Keep plugging away. At some point, the Bengals are going to want to turn to him, need to turn to him, and maybe that's sooner rather than later. And so hopefully he's doing the right things and getting more and more comfortable on offense, because they're going to need him at some point. And maybe that point is sooner rather than later.
I think part of what you said is a great segue into a conversation around Zac Taylor too, because you said they don't necessarily need to be high-end receivers, but they need guys that can win. And part of this offense, part of the Joe Burrow, Zac Taylor offense in Cincinnati really does need those guys to win and might need high-end wide receivers. I think we've seen Joe Burrow be productive when he's been missing his receivers. So obviously the offense can still go. They have to do things a little bit differently than I think they would prefer to at times, which is often a topic of criticism from fans. Why aren't they scheming guys open? Why is it so hard sometimes for them to get guys open? And sometimes that is because they're calling the wrong plays and they're getting clamped, and the defensive coordinator had their number on that play. And we talked about that this week, where we think they got thoroughly outcoached, at least I do, on offense too often by Jim Schwartz on the defensive side for the Browns this week. But sometimes it's, all right, we're going to ask our superstar wide receivers to go win on a play. And then when they do win, you get the Jamar Chase, T. Higgins touchdowns against the Browns. And in a game where the Browns are a great example to talk about this in the past. We talked about this with Mike. When a team's corners just have that swagger, which the Browns have had in years past, and play up to the challenge of defending T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, and at the time, Tyler Boyd, well, then things can be really hard. And so then it's, how does the coaching staff find the counter punches at the right time and get there a little bit more quickly than they have at times, where it's taken them a little bit too long to adjust, a little bit too long to find the answers to defensive coordinators that have their number. And then there's a whole conservatism issue around Zac Taylor at the end of games lately that we could talk about as well before we get to the defense, just because I think the conversation about wide receiver, one, it does go all the way back to the front office and roster construction as well at some point. But then it's in season, especially with this team that doesn't make their front office available, to the coaches to find the ways to make the pieces fit, which to their credit they have lately. But given the style of offense they have, they need those pieces to do things sometimes, or they need to find adaptations, right? That don't say, Jamar, go win against 2 guys in a bracket and beat that bracket because we really need you to win on this play. You know what I mean? Not that they're asking that all the time, but they ask a lot of those skill players.
Yeah, I do wonder too, because a lot of people are going to say Jermaine Burton. Who had the biggest play for this? I mean, I guess you could say T. Higgins or Jamar Chase, but Charlie Jones had like huge play on Sunday. Are we sure he can't get 10 slot snaps? Like, are we sure he can't be a chain mover somewhat? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe he can't. But I do think that that's interesting. I mean, it's not like I'm asking them to go back to the Trenton Irwin well here, but like, wouldn't that be good instead of just strictly relying on Andre for that role? And by the way, I think Andre can contribute. I'm not saying that, but
and he has in clutch moments too.
No doubt. But maybe that's it. Is like he's going to have his role, and you know what he likes, what he doesn't like, but he doesn't need to play 85% of the snaps or whatever it is. I'm not looking at the snap count in front of me. Maybe that's the answer. And again, going back to camp, there was a point where it was like, yeah, we think Andre, Trenton at the time, Charlie, Gesicki, all of these guys, or Jermaine, obviously, were going to contribute. Well, maybe it needs to be more of a committee approach there instead of a 3-headed monster approach, because they've given Andre chances and he's made big plays. There's no doubt, but we still haven't seen like the 8-catch, 7-catch performance. And I think, and maybe it's Sunday against the Eagles, by the way. I think he's capable of it, but we haven't seen it. And so now with the past couple of weeks, it's like, all right, well, what can they do outside of T and Jamar? Because you're right. Teams are going to, I mean, what I would have done is just doubled both of those guys and said, all right, someone else beat us. And I think that's what teams are going to do.
Because sometimes those other guys aren't winning enough to beat you. And that's the challenge for this Bengals offensive staff, I think, and Zac Taylor to find those answers of the reverse wishbone, as Dan Pitcher alluded to. One of those answers that got them some favorable matchups in that game, but they're going to continue to need to build and evolve the offense, and that's where I think we can get to some of the Zac Taylor criticism as well, because I think there's a lot of it out there right now, James. We can do that, discuss the defense, and we have to make sure we discuss those injury updates we have to finish the show coming up next.
Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, and the Bengals 2.5-point favorites over the Eagles on Sunday. Will that line move? Well, that's why you got to get to America's #1 sportsbook with FanDuel, because whether it's NFL, whether it's NBA, and the NBA in full swing starting now, which is always crazy. It always sneaks up on me a bit. College football, they have everything in anything you could want to wager on, whether it's same game parlays, prop bets. Maybe you want to get in on the Joe Burrow to Jamar Chase connection. Maybe you think that Jermaine Burton is going to have a big day. Well, they have those prop bets. So get to FanDuel.com right now and get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, that's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet at FanDuel.com. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook.
Let's get some thoughts in on the Zac Taylor criticism here quickly before we get to the defense and those injuries, because it is a hot topic again. There are some people, and I'm not speaking at all to whether or not I agree with it yet, but who think Zac Taylor is essentially the same coach he's always been, that they have these conservatism issues at the end of games, that his teams too often come out flat, that his teams too often don't have the killer instinct. And we have seen them have it at times. This year, we haven't seen them play that complete game. It's something that I've asked them to do several weeks, something that I talked about after the game. That was my big, yeah, but can they just do it for a whole game? We haven't seen that. And in addition to that, you have, stuff like play calling, which at times I've agreed with this year, I think more than years past, where they're getting got by defensive coordinators a little bit more often. Where are you on some of the Zac Taylor criticism right now?
Yeah, I think game on the line, I default to this, or knockout blow, I'm okay dropping back. I'm okay going empty. I'm okay, like, just here and there. You don't have to be so conservative. And I think we've seen that now a couple of times. And Evan misses that 50-yarder. And by the way, you could argue that, like, all right, well, the misses are why, or the botched hold against Baltimore. At the same time, we know that Joe has that killer instinct. We know that Jamar Chase has that killer instinct, and T. Higgins, like, that's not up for debate. And so if that's what you want, put the ball in those guys' hands. And this team is always going to be this pass first. So I think that's where my criticism is, honestly, is at the end of these games, the Baltimore game, which we talked a ton about, the 3 straight runs in overtime, or when you have a real chance to just end the game. And they've ended the game throwing the ball in the past. It's okay to end it that way. Like, this idea, and a lot of people think, oh, well, you have to be able to run the ball. Run the ball in the AFC North. The Bengals won back-to-back division titles without having a high-end running game. And I'm okay with them putting the ball in Joe Burrow's hands for the knockout blow essentially every time. Unless there's like 4 guys in the box, which is pretty darn rare, or it's just so obvious that you should run it. I'm okay with Joe making the call, especially because he's been so good at taking care of the ball. I rattled off those stats. He has 2 picks this year, 2. So he's taking care of the ball, and it's not like the fumbling thing early in the season has continued to be a thing. I don't think that's a thing. And so why not do that? That's where my criticism mainly lies.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit confounded because our most recent example of this against Cleveland that ends in a missed field goal, the 50-yard field goal that it's very easy to argue you settle for, is Cody Ford at left tackle, and you're kind of getting by with him. You scored a couple touchdowns with him at left tackle, but in a 3rd and whatever situation, and maybe that means you just pass on an earlier down, and I think that's part of it too.
That's it right there. Yep.
That isn't a palatable approach once you get to that 3rd and 8 or whatever it was.
I think it was 3rd and 12. but pass on first down, so it doesn't matter.
You take a sack trying to throw it on first down. At least you tried. And there will probably be people out there that say, you should have just run the ball, just run the clock. And part of it is that Taylor is reacting to the way games are going, and you can't fault him too much for that, I guess. Or maybe that's not the right way to put it. That's a mitigating factor, let's say. The defense has been playing well against Cleveland. And so, okay, we're going to do it this way. We're going to rely on them. And there's not much time left. But it would be nice to see the team embody that killer instinct a little bit more. And my other big criticism, like I said, is it just feels like they've been outcoached a couple of times this year, more than I've felt that way in the past, with some of the play calling just into the teeth of defenses at times. Not even talking about like being too cute or calling a run when they should call a pass, just like pass concepts that are getting got. That's happening a little bit too often for me.
Sure. Yeah. Let's real quick before we get to the defense, we'll get to some injury updates. Orlando Brown Jr., obviously this is a big one. Zac Taylor called him day-to-day on Monday. All right. So what he's dealing with is like this upper calf issue that's in the back of his knee. And so you're going to see reporting on both sides of it. It is technically a calf issue, but you can feel it up there. It's high enough to where he'll feel it in the back of his knee. We'll see if he plays this week. I think that there's a shot, certainly as we record this on Tuesday, that he does play, but there's also a chance that he doesn't. And what do they do there? I'll get to that in just a second, potentially. And we got to get to the defense too. So, man, we should have recorded multiple shows today, Jake. Geno Stone dodged a complete bullet. It sounds like he's going to play this week. And much like he said in the locker room after the game to me, where he said, I'm good. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean that, but he is good. X-rays came back negative, putting weight on that ankle, on that foot. So dealing with a shin issue is I think how they'll describe it. So he might be limited earlier in the week, but wouldn't be shocked at all if he plays on Sunday. Feels like it's trending in that direction. Do you want the Bengals to sign a veteran offensive tackle, Jake, with Orlando Brown Jr. hobbled a bit?
I wanted them to do it before, and I want them to do it even more now. Yes, 100%. Like, there's no question. And there are guys out there that we discussed before the show that I think are better than the depth they have. We don't need to go practice squad poaching right now. They can get actual players with regular season experience to help them. And this goes back to the Calais Campbell issue that we've talked about too. Like, you need to get over the age thing for stopgap solutions. And that's where I would be looking right now if I were the Bengals. But I do not feel very confident that they feel that way, which goes to, like I said earlier, some of these issues go back to the front office that are harder to talk about in the middle of the season because we never talk to the front office in the middle of the season.
Yeah, I think go get one. Go get yourself one. I'm trying to will it. I wrote something for BengalsTalk.com. I'm trying to will it out there, Jake, of go get one. Most of the time they don't listen, but you never know. Defensively, they went and signed someone older than me, so why not, right? That Lawrence guy still on the roster. Defensively, though, it's been better the past couple of weeks. Big picture-wise, I think that they're going to settle in and kind of be around league average. Like, I still think that this offense, and part of why we spent so much time on this offense, I think they need their offense to be elite most weeks. And that doesn't mean every week. I think Lou will have the right elixir at some points, and you'll see them force turnovers like they did against the Browns. But we're probably talking about the 16th best defense in the NFL or the 18th best defense in the NFL. I'm not sure they get much higher than that, which is fine with me because I have pretty high expectations for this offense.
They're currently 20th in DVOA. The offense is 6th. The offense has dipped a little bit after a couple of lower scoring, lower output performances against better defenses. The defense has obviously bumped up in DVOA rankings after a couple of more limiting performances, albeit against bad offenses. The thing I keep going back to with this defense is they've mostly played kind of to the level of the competition. The Washington Commanders apparently have a great offense. The Baltimore Ravens have a great offense. The Kansas City Chiefs, despite all the issues Patrick Mahomes has had this year, still have a good offense according to DVOA that ranks higher than the Bengals offense by DVOA. So while it hasn't been pretty in Kansas City, that's still a good offense, despite some of the injuries they've sustained since playing the Bengals back in week 2. So against some of these teams that have good offenses, they've given up a lot of points and they've looked really bad, and they were really injured in those games as well, getting a little bit healthier against worse offenses, we've seen them play as you would expect them to play. So you're right. I think they're somewhere in the middle. And the hope would have to be, and the reason that this show kind of is structured the way it was and the conversation flowed the way it did today, is that if they are going to be a contender this year, it involves the offense doing its thing and Lou Anarumo being able to game plan up games when he needs them, as we've seen them do in the past, where the defense has had, really, you look at Lou's history, one top ranking year where they've been a consistently good defense. And outside of that, like, the defensive rankings haven't been great, but they've gotten those performances in games they've needed them, because Lou has been and has this reputation of being a game plan, scheme, specific game oriented coach, where they can get the performances in those games. And honestly, in years past, the defense has been the team that has won them a lot of games where they've been close. And this year they need the offense. And this is why we're talking about killer instinct and finishing games this year. The offense needs to take a little bit more of that burden. And if the offense is able to do that just a little bit more, think about all the plays we talked about against Kansas City, against Washington, against Baltimore, where if they make one more play, the Bengals can win those games. They will need to do that this year, because the defense, I think, is not going to necessarily be consistently making those plays we've seen them make in the past in clutch situations that we've gotten so accustomed to.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a good way to put it. I do hope that a Geno Stone continues to settle in and dodges that bullet after having his best game as a Bengal for sure. And so hopefully he can continue to make plays and they can be opportunistic. They're due for a Logan Wilson, Jermaine Pratt forced turnover. It's been a little bit for Pratt. Logan Wilson, interception wise, maybe. I do think that the Sheldon Rankins express hopefully has taken off too. So like I do think that there are guys that can make those impact plays, and they just didn't have that early on in the year. And so if you're talking about the 16th to 20th DVOA defense by DVOA, you take that, especially if they're forcing some of those big plays, which is exactly what they need starting on Sunday in Philly. Or, well, against Philly, rather. Not in Philly. Thank goodness we don't have to travel, Jake. I will be here in the Queen City, where I love to be.
Overall, just while we're on the topic of DVOA, last point here, the Bengals down to 12 overall in DVOA, despite winning a couple of games. So I think their overall ranking, they're slipping a little bit. Back when they were 1-4, they were the best 1-4 DVOA team, or one of the best 1-4 DVOA teams ever. They were still in the top 10 of DVOA. They were still in the top 10 of all the aggregate, analytical power rankings at the time. But they need to beat a good team, or at least an average team. And they have an opportunity to do so this week.
Just so everyone knows, it's defense adjusted value over average is DVOA. So it's team success based on down and distance of each play and all of those things. So it's a good way to evaluate outside of the basic numbers how teams are performing on offense, defense, et cetera.
It tries to put into context yards. It's like a predecessor to EPA per play and all these things. It's great for a big picture conversation, because that's what it tells you about, is really big picture kind of numbers, and kind of gives some context to, offensive output, defensive output over the course of a season, something that we'll continue to refer to. So nice that we defined it here at the very end of the show. Maybe we'll define it earlier for the people next time I bring it up. And I'll try to do a better job at that. But that is going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Next one coming up with Locked On Eagles. Until then, thanks for listening. Hoo day, and have a good one.